I'm very excited to share some recent results from two student projects, where in particular an undergraduate student played a prominent role in doing this research. And as you've maybe noticed, the title that I sent says 100 supernova simulations, but this is actually a typo and it should say 1,000. So I'm hoping you're 10 times as excited about this talk now that you know the real title. All right, so the two projects I'm going to be talking about are, one is published in AppJ Letters last year, and the other one we've submitted to AppJ and are in the process of doing the revisions. And Noah Wolf was an undergraduate here at NC State, and he played a leading role in both of these projects in terms of running the simulations for the first ones and doing the entire analysis for the second one. The analysis in the first paper was done by Mikhail Meshki, who's a computer science graduate student at Houston, who applied data science techniques to our data set of order of 1,000 supernova simulations. So the credit really goes to these two students. All right, let me start by briefly introducing or reminding you of core collapse supernovae. So first of all, every time I say supernova for this talk, I really mean core collapse supernova. And with this diagram here, I want to remind you that we have this general idea of a massive star at the end of its life. It collapses, this collapse somehow turns around, and the star explodes, or maybe doesn't explode. But this simple picture that we have kind of in a textbook sense is actually much more complicated. And simulating this scenario is computationally expensive because you require a lot of different physics, from general relativity to the nuclear physics of dense matter to neutrino transport. But it's also inherently multidimensional, as you can see in the top right figure from this image, NASA image of, or Chandra image of CAS A. This is not as nicely spherically symmetric as the cartoon of the progenitor star that will explode, leading to this remnant that's shown to the left of the Chandra image. And in addition, it's a multi-scale problem in the sense that we have very short time and length scales and very long time and length scales that are relevant. So this makes simulations of core collapse supernovae a computationally expensive problem. Now, the status of the field is that in spherically symmetric or 1D simulations, generally, unless you do something, you do the best physics you can, it doesn't lead to explosions. And this is shown in the bottom left figure, which is from a code comparison paper led by Evan O'Connor. It shows different one-dimensional simulations. It shows the shock radius and the protoneutron star radius as a function of time. And you can see these simulations don't explode. The shock retreats again after about 0.1 or 2 seconds. The shock radius decreases. And also you can see that pretty much all of these codes agree. So we have a good agreement and good understanding in 1D, but no explosions. In 2D, we are moving in that direction, that similar input gives similar results. And in 3D, we're still, as a field, as a community, there's many models are close to explosion thresholds. The explosion, whether a model explodes or not, can be code dependent. The problem, as I said earlier, and is depicted in the middle panel here, is inherently not spherically symmetric. So we really need 3 dimensions. And it's also a computationally expensive problem. So in the figure on the right, I again show shock radius as a function of time. This is from a paper by Adam Burrows. And this is about a dozen multidimensional simulations that are shown. And that's really the scale at which we can do multidimensional simulations. So we can do more than a few, but it's still, say, order of 10 and not enough to do a statistical analysis of these simulations, or even to probe a large parameter space of initial stars, nuclear equations of state, or other things you might want to explore which one is the closest to nature. And so in today's talk, I want to talk about two projects that went sort of in a complementary direction. we are not aiming at understanding the explosion mechanism. Instead, we want to look at what are detectable observables from supernovae and how do they vary across the range of progenitors, nuclear equations of state, different things we can do that we either don't have a good handle on, like the nuclear equation of state, where we don't know what the true nuclear equation of state in nature is. And also, we know a range of masses of stars and metallicities of stars explodes as core collapse supernovae. So what do these stars look like in their observables? And this is not a project where we match one simulation with one observation. These are both projects where we look at the set of simulations and look at trends and what we can learn from a large number of simulations. Now, how are we doing this, given that I just told you that multidimensional simulations are computationally very expensive? And we're doing this with what we call an effective supernova model, and there are several on the market. Several groups have developed them. The underlying idea is to parameterize an aspect of the multidimensional simulations that we think is relevant to causing the explosion, parameterize that in a spherically symmetric way. You might think, oh, thermal bomb or piston models, but these effective models are different in the sense that they're self-consistent within the model. So yes, effective models have parameters, but we don't tune them or set them for every simulation we run. We tune them in all of these models, whether it's push, p hot b, or stir. There's a parameter that gets calibrated typically against one model against one observation of 1987A, and then applied to all our other simulations. So in a sense, except for the one simulation we use to calibrate, all the others are predictions, at least within the framework of this effective model. And that's one of the strengths of these effective models, is that we can perform a lot of simulations and predict within this model framework what the outcome might be. And so I'm showing you one example here from actually 6 different groups looking at which stars explode or don't explode. And so the plots all show conceptually the same thing across a range of progenitor masses shown on the horizontal axes in some way or the other, whether these models exploded or not. And I'm highlighting with this yellow circle a range around 20 solar masses, maybe a little bit above, maybe a little bit below, depending on which of the 6 figures you're looking at, where we see black holes that were not necessarily expected before this work had been done. You can see that they don't, each of these different models don't places that island of non-explodability in at a slightly different mass, but overall, no matter how you parameterize and create your effective model, they all share general properties of their outcomes. And so for the projects, the results I'm going to show you later in this talk, we're using the push model or the push method. And the underlying idea here is that in multi-D, the neutrino heating is enhanced compared to 1D. And so we're mimicking the net effect of that, which is a larger neutrino heating, neutrino energy deposition, in a parameterized way. We do this by transferring a fraction of the energy that's in heavy lepton flavor neutrinos, deposit that into the matter in spatial and temporal locations where electron neutrinos are already heating. Some of the key strengths or key features, if you wish, of this method for the results I'm showing you is one, that we don't have to excise the inner core that becomes the protoneutron star. There's naturally a protoneutron star forming. There's naturally a separation between ejected matter and the protoneutron star forming. So the mass that's in the protoneutron star is a predicted quantity within our framework. It's not imposed by hand. The same way the amount of ejecta is predicted, it's not put in by hand. We also do not touch the electron flavor neutrinos, so the electron fraction in our models evolves. It's not just a progenitor electron fraction hit by a shock wave. It evolves during collapse and the reversal of this collapse into explosion, which means we can within our framework, predict which models explode and which ones don't, and also predict for these models a neutron star mass or a black hole mass. So what we did is apply this push method to of order of 1,000 simulations or models. And in this table, I'm showing you across the different nuclear equations of state that we used and down the 4 different progenitor sets that we used. We have 2 different at solar metallicity. We have 1 set of models at 10 to the minus 4 solar metallicity and 1 set at 0 metallicity. You can see that there's a finer grid for solar metallicity models than for the lower metallicities. And for the DD2 equation of state, we ran somewhat more models than for other equations of state. But overall, this is order of 1,000 simulations done with different equations of state and different progenitor masses. We've used a subset of these simulations for a variety of other projects that are listed here. But for today, I want to focus on the remnant masses and the gravitational wave signals from these simulations. This is actually a slightly outdated figure because now the white spots are filled too. This is for 6 of these equations of state. And each of the colors is one of the progenitor sets, just color coding whether they exploded or not. And you can see that across equations of state, the patterns look somewhat similar, but the details can be different. But this is really just a visual depiction of 6/8 of these 1,000 models. Latimer's Swesti EOS and the Shen EOS are not shown in these 6 panels for space reason. So this is the set of simulations we're working with. And so in this first project, we said, what can we learn about the equation of state from these simulations? And so really what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare our distribution of neutron star masses and black hole masses to observed neutron star and black hole masses. Now, this is easier said than done because in our simulations depicted in the top row of my slide, there's a nice linear sequence. You take a progenitor star, you collapse it, it explodes or doesn't, and you get a neutron star or black hole. So we know exactly which neutron star or black hole goes with which progenitor star. In nature, our observations don't give us these pairs. Our observations are separate data sets of black hole masses, neutron star masses, of supernovae, of stars. So in nature, we don't have sort of an input-output pair the same way we have for simulations. So instead of basically minimizing or optimizing over the equation of state for these input-output pairs, in this case, we have marginal distributions that we have to compare. So for this project, we simulated the explosions with the push method. We used different nuclear equations of state depicted in the bottom left by this mass radius plot to show you kind of the range of these equations of state. We got computed a distribution of simulated neutron star masses or black hole masses. We pulled from the literature the observed or inferred from observations neutron star and black hole mass distributions, and then did a statistical analysis to compute the distance between these 2 distributions. So these results are shown here, where the left panel is black holes, the right panel is neutron stars. And the black dashed line, which is very prominent in the black hole picture, is the observed distribution. In the neutron star panel on the right, there's actually 4 lines in different shades of black, the black dashed, which is the one we're comparing to, but there's also these gray dotted and dashed dotted lines. This is from neutron star masses are observed in different systems, and whether they're in concentric or eccentric systems, whether the binary companion is compact or another compact object or not, the distributions look different. And so we couldn't easily merge them into one distribution. So we plotted all 4. Push inherently simulates isolated stars. So we felt neutron stars that are in a binary with a non-compact object might be the closest to what we're simulating. And so we computed the distance between our computed curves and this black dashed line. The colored lines are the inferred distributions from our simulations per equation of state. And for the black holes, this double peak feature that you see in the colored line comes from this island of non-explodability for sort of around 20, 25 solar masses. Some of the stars don't explode, and that's this dip that you see in some of these curves here. So these are the pure distributions. We then applied two different distance measure, the KL divergence and the TV distance, to quantitatively measure the distance between the observed and the simulated distributions. And so in the top left of this slide, I have a table that has the actual numbers for black holes and neutron stars, in each case for both the measures that we used. But instead of reading the numbers, we also display them on the right in a way that should guide your eye. So the vertical axis is, or like the left column is black holes, the right column is neutron stars, the top row is KL divergence, the bottom row is the TV distance. What we plot in each of these four panels is the distance measure per EOS and subtract from that the average distance across all EOSs, which means if the value plotted on the vertical axis is less than 0, this equation of state is more favored. If the value on the vertical axis is positive, the EOS is less favored. And the error bars are the 95% confidence intervals on this. So we had hoped that one equation of state would somehow stand out, but really the conclusion from this is feasible. This is a proof of concept. If you only look at neutron star and black hole masses, it's very hard to pick, either rule out equations of state or say these are maybe more favorable than others. They're all very sort of the same order, close to the average distance of 0, with maybe DD2 slightly favored in these models. And surprisingly, SFHO and SFHX may be slightly disfavored.
Carla, there is a question from Susan. Susan is trying to ask you a question. So can she ask?
If I may, sorry, I wanted to actually ask about your lack of a mass gap between neutron stars and black holes. And in principle, we seem to see one in LIGO LVK data, but your simulations or your models seem to fill in that gap. And I was wondering if you had any particular comment about that.
There actually is
by assumption, or if there's something particular about your procedure that you naturally fill in, so you have black holes less than 7 solar masses.
So we do see a gap in the sense that our neutron stars don't exceed about 2.2 solar masses, and our black holes start, if you make the most, I don't know whether you want to call it most optimistic or most pessimistic assumption in terms of how much of this mass at collapse will end up in the black hole. That our lowest black holes are around about 4.5 or so solar masses. So we do have a gap, but it's not at 7 solar masses. It's closer to, say, 3 to 4 solar masses. I have to clarify that the neutron star masses, that's how they come out of the simulation. For the black hole, the code we're using cannot, once the singularity forms, we cannot continue the simulations. So we have to make an assumption of how much of the stellar mass that's present at collapse ultimately ends up in the black hole. You could imagine that some of it gets blown off and doesn't end up in the black hole, or you could assume that all of the stellar mass present at collapse would also be in the black hole. So that gives us a slight range of black hole masses depending on what assumption you make about how much of the stellar mass at collapse ends up in the black hole.
Can you give us an estimate of how much you think that black hole mass should shift? If, for example, all the stellar material goes into the black hole?
Yeah, so the assumption that we took that led to the smallest black hole masses is saying that only the carbon-oxygen core of the star ends up in the black hole. And the largest black hole masses that we could estimate is the mass at collapse. So the difference is the hydrogen and the helium layer at most. But a lot of these stars have lost most of their hydrogen. The solar metallicity stars at least have lost their hydrogen layer and deep into the helium layer. So for the most massive stars in our sample, that difference is very small. For the lightest stars that become a black hole, that difference can be up to the helium and part of the hydrogen layer, which can be quite a big number.
So it could be a significant fraction, because obviously we're looking at the very lightest black holes. More likely they had lighter progenitors. And then you're suggesting that there would be a non-trivial, as yet unquantified fractional shift due to this partial hydrogen layer that you were discussing.
So if you're looking at this plot, the red bars are the zero metallicity stars. So those have the largest hydrogen helium masses, and you can see that they're the lowest ones that don't explode are maybe 23, 24 solar masses.
Okay.
For the blue and the green, which are solar metallicity, they're all completely stripped of their hydrogen layer.
Okay, so but
I can look up the number for the hydrogen layers.
I was just curious, but it doesn't. But thank you. I don't want to disrupt you further. I think you've been very clear. But you've been quite clear. Thank you so much.
All right. All right, where were we? All right, here. So the two caveats that come with this result is our sample that we exploded for this paper we did not have any stars in the 8 to 11 solar mass range, meaning the lowest mass stars that become core collapse supernovae and are the most abundant in the initial mass function of all the stars that become core collapse supernovae are missing. So we're probably missing, especially for the neutron stars, we're missing the lightest neutron stars that come out of core collapse supernovae. Also, this is all based on the idea of a single isolated star. We now know that most stars live in binaries or maybe even multiplets. So these are all effects that are not captured by our push simulations and by the progenitors we had available for this study. Obviously, looking at different progenitors, these are all from the Kepler code. So they're in a sense all similar because they come from the same code. Would be interesting, but I think the scientifically most interesting direction to go is to expand this analysis to include other observables beyond just remnant masses. All right, that's the first project that we did with our sample of 1,000 supernova simulations. Now I want to move on to the other project that we did, and this is really all Noah Wolf's undergraduate work while he was at NC State. He's now a graduate student in Salvo's lab at MIT doing LIGO work. And so for this project, we asked, what can we say about a potential gravitational wave signal from core collapse supernovae? Now, gravitational waves are inherently a multi-dimensional phenomenon. And I'm showing this on the left as an example. The plot on the left has a spectrogram at the top and the strain is a function of time at the bottom. You need multidimensional simulations to get the strain of these gravitational waves. Now, we do expect that with advanced LIGO, this would be within the detective or sensitivity range of LIGO, as shown on the right, where anything above the black solid line would be within reach of advanced LIGO, and in blue and red, the colored noisy curves underneath are one of the predictions. This is from David Radice's paper, and you can see that there is signal above that black line and would be detectable. taking this a little bit further before I tell you what we exactly did, is this is from a recent paper out of the Oak Ridge group, which again shows the top left, the strain as a function of time, spectrograms from different regions, the total on the top left, and then 5 different regions within the star, which are the convective from 1 through 5 going inside to out. Is the region that's convectively unstable, then it's a region that's its outer bound is at a density of 10 to the 12 grams per cubic centimeter. The next region goes out to a density of 10 to the 11 grams per cubic centimeter, which is also what they define as the protoneutron star surface. The 4th region is the cooling layer, and the 5th region is the gain layer. So if you look at the right column and the bottom 2 panels of the left column, that tells you the contributions from these different layers to the top, to the total signal shown in the top left plot. And you can see that most of the signal, or a stronger component of the signal, comes from region 1, which is from the protoneutron star, or region 1 and 2, which are all within this boundary of 10 to the 11 grams per cubic centimeter, which is commonly defined as the protoneutron star surface. In addition to the amplitude, the gravitational wave signals have a frequency. And the plot on the right shows the frequency of the protoneutron star at 3 different densities, or if you define the protoneutron star surface at 3 different densities. You can see a clear time evolution of this dominant frequency. And so for the analysis we did, because our simulations are spherically symmetric, we do not get an amplitude of the GW signal. So what we instead did is we were guided by basically conceptually the plot on the right, that there's a dominant frequency of the GW signal that comes from the protoneutron star region, and that's contributing the most to your amplitude of the signal. So this is something we can study in 1D, which is what does this frequency evolution look like? And this is a complementary approach to actually doing the multidimensional simulations and truly computing the GW signal, which on the 4 references I'm showing here are different works who have done an analysis of this type. The complementary path, and the path we chose, is to do a linear perturbation analysis of the hydrodynamics background and from that get a time evolution of the dominant frequency, but no amplitudes. And there's several papers looking at various correlations of these frequencies with different properties of the protoneutron star. Ultimately, all of these works kind of end up with some sort of universal relationship between the frequency of the dominant frequency of the GW signal and the protoneutron star properties. So we wanted to do the same analysis on our suite of 1,000+ models and see what we can learn from it. So let me remind you first that we did this for 6 equations of state. So on the right panel, I'm showing you in a mass radius diagram, in fact, 8 equations of state. There's some nicer observations on there, and maximum masses of above 2 solar masses are also indicated. These are just the cold mass radius curves. On the left panel, I'm showing only the 6 equations of state we used for this project. And on top of these mass radius relationship curves, there's a very high density of points that these arrows point to. That's where our 1,000 simulations sit. So in remnant mass, this again gives you a nice kind of overview of the range of neutron star masses that we get from our simulations. And we're only populating, even with 1,000 simulations, we're only populating a small part of this mass radius curve of any given equation of state. So this is just a different view on the 1,000 simulations. We then did, as a function of time for the first second of the simulation, we did, for every time slice, we did this eigenfrequency analysis, which gave us for every single model data of the type that's depicted in this panel on the left. So as a function of post-bounce time, it shows the frequency of all the different modes, indicated by these gray dots that really look like gray lines. Now, once you have all these frequencies, you have to do mode identification. And this is actually the trickiest part of this type of analysis. And in the past has only been done on data sets of the order of 10, 20 simulations where you can actually go in by hand and do mode identification by hand. You cannot do that for 1,000 simulations. So we used the Cowling scheme to automatically identify modes, and basically in green is highlighted the fundamental mode that we do our analysis on. You can see that where my mouse or my pointer is right now, that there's two gray lines or series of points that seem to touch. This is what we call an avoided crossing. Before that, it's very hard to automatically identify the F mode. We have then repeated the analysis with this G1 mode that's highlighted in blue here to estimate how our results would change if our automatic mode identification had some issues and we might not always find the F mode, or maybe the F mode is not actually the mode, the frequency with the largest amplitude. If it's not the F mode, it should be the G1 mode. So with this, we are covering the two modes that are expected to have the largest amplitudes in the GW signals. So if we do that for 1,000 models, this is what it looks like. These are F mode frequencies as a function of post-bounce time organized by equation of state, and each line or each model is color-coded by the remnant mass of that simulation. And you can see some trends in these results. At early times, the frequency of the F mode seems to be EOS dependent. At least there's some like TM1 or NL3 that at early times have 200 hertz lower F mode frequency than say SFHO or SFHX. And we also see differences at later times, how big of a spread in frequencies might come out for a particular equation of state. And so these are two features that we've observed and that we wanted to further explore in this work. So what we did to do all this statistical analysis is turn these time frequency diagrams into histogram. So for each model, we just count up every frequency, how often, at how many time slices it occurs, and this gives us these histograms. For each EOS 3 out of the about 200 a piece histograms that are highlighted in color are for that particular EOS, the simulation that led to the lowest neutron star mass, the median neutron star mass, and the highest neutron star mass. That's just a way of highlighting 3 of these histograms to give you an idea of what they look like. But you can see in the gray underneath that they're all similar, but there's also a variation within that similarity. And then we proceeded to fit each of these histograms with a Gaussian mixture of basically two Gaussians superimposed. And I'm showing 3 examples on the right. This is across all simulations, all EOSs, the lightest neutron star mass, the median neutron star mass, and the largest neutron star mass from top to bottom. So in each of these 3 panels on the right, you see a histogram that's just the binned frequencies. There's a dashed line on top, that's the fit to this 2 Gaussian mix model. And then we identified what we call mu1 and mu2, the frequency of these 2 Gaussian peaks. So these are these vertical lines that are shown here, or here and here, or here and here. And it turns out that the peak at lower frequency is always from earlier times, typically before about 0.4 seconds post-bounce, and the peak at the higher frequencies is always from at later times. And that makes sense if you remember this plot, the frequencies in general increase with increasing time. So From now on, we do all the analysis on the two frequencies mu1 and mu2, which characterize the early time peak in frequencies and the late time peak in frequencies. So first of all, on the left, I'm showing mu1, so the characteristic early time frequency, as a histogram color-coded by EOS. And you can see there is SFHO and SFHX at early times have 100, 150 hertz higher frequency than pretty much all the other equations of state. So from this, we concluded that potentially if we have the frequency of the GW signal at early times, even if we don't know exactly at what time post-bounce this is from, maybe one can rule out or favor some equations of state, depending on whether that frequency is closer to 850 hertz or 1000 hertz. On the right, I'm showing you the late time characteristic frequency mu2 against m over r squared for the protoneutron star, or the remnant. And as you can see, almost all of our simulations lie on a very nice tight band, and the colors that indicate the equation of state, all the simulations per equation of state, are roughly in the same part of this diagram. So again, from this, we would not expect to be able to distinguish, say, DD2 or BHP lambda phi, the two shades of blue, but potentially we can distinguish between an SFHO or SFHX type equation of state and a TM1 or NL3 type equation of state. The BHP lambda phi equation of state, which allows for hyperons to form, has a series of models that are outside of these nice tight correlations. And we originally thought this was due to this transition to hyperons, but there's absolutely no correlation with the fraction of hyperons or any other quantity we thought of. So the bottom line is we don't actually understand what these models that are outside of the gray band have in common and different from all the other models. All right. Having these both early time characteristic frequency and late time characteristic frequency, we then went ahead and compared against other works that have done the same type of eigenfrequency analysis of protoneutron stars. And so here we're showing mass over radius squared and the horizontal axis against the frequency. As frequency usually goes up with time, you can read this graph as any given simulation kind of proceeds from the bottom left towards the top right in some sense. The colored points in the middle here, those are the sets of our simulations color-coded by equation of state. And the lines with their error bands are taken from the literature from other papers where they did the same analysis on a much smaller set of simulations and found what they call universal relationships between m over r squared and the dominant frequency of the GW signal. Now, there's several things to point out. First of all, our simulations seem to have a different curvature, if you wish, in m over r squared versus frequency space, though it is a little bit deceiving because our density of points is so high. The shape of, say, the orange blob you see in this plot is not actually the shape of any given simulation that evolves. Also, this end of points that's shown slightly more transparent on the left, these are from very early times that all the other analyses that we pulled from the literature have excluded. So to include the same post-bounce time range as these universal relationships that we're over plotting, we should only start plotting these solid colored points that roughly coincide with the edge of the gray error band. So we're somewhat consistent with what other groups have found, but there's also differences, and we are collaborating with these groups to try and identify what is the underlying reason for these differences. Obviously, the supernova simulations that different groups have used are very different. The yellow dashed line with the yellow error band is probably the closest to our simulations in the sense that it's also fully GR simulation and only GR simulations used in that universal relationship. But there's so many pieces that go into a supernova simulation, from the neutrino transport, the equation of state, the progenitors, your grid, so many things that can cause ultimately differences. So this is something, the future work that we have to want to understand better, what of these pieces might explain some of the differences we see in those universal relationships. All right, and with that, I'm going to come to my conclusions here. And I hope I have convinced you that effective supernova models have exciting applications that are complementary to multidimensional simulations, that they're able to produce synthetic data sets of supernovae and their multi-messenger observables that are large enough to apply data science or statistics tools on them. And they're very useful to probe across large ranges of progenitors, equations of state, whatever parameter space you want to look at, and get a sense of the bulk properties of those supernovae that come out. What I have not shown you in this talk is all the light curve calculations we did and all the nucleosynthesis calculations that we also did for these models, so that we're actually truly sitting on multi-messenger predictions from these models. But I wanted to focus for this talk on the remnants and the corresponding eigenfrequencies of that protoneutron star. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. So are there any questions for Professor Fröhlich? I can see one hand.
I cannot see.
Yeah, so I can see one hand by Serut. So Serut, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi Carla. Thanks for the excellent talk. Actually, since you started talking about the model, I want to ask a question that I probably should already know the answer to, but how do your distributions of the elements form compare to the elements that we see in supernovae and supernova remnants?
So let me maybe just find the slide for this. So predominantly we've compared the elements. We focused on the iron group elements because these come from deep inside the star. These are not dominated by progenitor abundances. So if you look at, say, magnesium, these are dominated by how you treat the nucleosynthesis during stellar evolution. So that doesn't tell you anything about the explosion. So we focus on iron group elements. And for this comparison that I'm showing you here, we compared against metal poor stars that are commonly thought to be polluted by one or maybe a few core collapse supernovae. So in all of these plots, the left four are DD2 equation of state simulations. The one on the right is SFHO equation of state. The triangles in all these plots are observations. And the squares, each square is one of our simulations. And they're translucent such that if they had all given the same value, for example, like iron that we normalize to, they will give you the full solid color. So that the opacity of these colored bars tells you how many simulations gave a particular yield for an element. And so the one on the right is a little easier to read in the sense that all progenitors are in one plot. And you can see that generally the observations and the simulations match. Titanium is notoriously underproduced in spherically symmetric simulations because titanium comes from material that's deep inside, and often if you look in multidimensional simulations from tracers or blobs of matter that have very complicated trajectories in and out, remaining a long time in somewhat close proximity to the hot protoneutron star, that in 1D you just can't have because matter can only fall in or go out. So that's why titanium is underproduced.
These observations, are they a collection of many observations?
So this particular plot is just for one metal poor star where you see that there's two triangles. And this was from a paper by Chris Sneeden and collaborators, where for the first time they had good enough data that they could determine the abundances both from a neutral species of any of these elements and from an ionized species, and get more or less the same amount, which is what you would assume, that there's only one chromium abundance or one manganese abundance for this star.
Okay, and so are the errors on these measurements smaller than you would get from trying to get the abundances of an explosion directly?
The errors of the measurements are, you ask whether they're smaller than the error bars you
Yeah, I'm just wondering,
from,
like, if people have taken like all the supernova spectra that we know about and identified the abundances from the supernovae directly.
so from the supernovae directly, we have for iron group, we basically have nickel 56 and maybe 57 and 58 in a few cases. So there's the other elements are not, the other elements I'm showing here, you would not get directly from the supernova. In the remnant, you can see titanium, but mostly you have to go look in metal poor stars. Now, of course, this is just one. There is, if you took 100 metal poor stars, you're going to get a bigger range of observed yields than a single star will show you here. I think the key point that I want to add to my answer is the manganese here, where you basically, the simulations kind of fall into two groups. The ones that are much lower than observations are stars that had a very small nuclear reaction network during stellar evolution, which means those are mostly alpha elements, so equal number of neutrons and protons with only a small number of isotopes that do not have basically a corresponding YE of 0.5. And so your YE profile is much less rich in those cases, and that even if you follow the YE through the collapse and explosion, that still is imprinted on your final YE and the abundances you make in the explosive nucleosynthesis. And these green green models predominantly that are up here, they have a much larger network in the stellar evolution. So the YE profile can be richer because you have more different nuclei that can be populated, not just predominantly YE of 0.5 nuclei. And that carries through the explosion and seems to be key to get manganese at more realistic values. So stellar evolution people, please include large networks. It matters.
Okay, Susan?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I wanted to be sure I understood the push framework. You would remark that you wanted to parameterize aspects of multidimensional simulations in the context of a spherical framework. And I guess it begs the question of whether or not there are any particular observables that would be particularly sensitive to asymmetry, aspherical symmetry. And one question I would have is, I remember reading that that sometimes the pulsars can recede with non-trivial velocities. They can have kicks. That would seem to be like a natural imprimatur of a non-spherical explosion. And I was wondering if that's an interesting data set to try to confront. If you have anything to say about that, and whether, how to say, I just wanted to, because that seems to me an observable that might be beyond push, but maybe not. And so I just was wondering if you could offer a perspective on that.
Yeah, so pulsar kicks are beyond the push framework. So we would need to do multidimensional simulations for those. The push framework originally I developed because I was interested in nucleosynthesis, and piston and thermal bomb models notoriously were still not able to, especially in the iron group elements, to reproduce what we see in nature. And then it became obvious that we can do a lot of other things, but of course there's always the underlying limitation or characteristic, however you want to be optimistic or pessimistic about, that it's a single star in spherical symmetry. So for protoneutron star properties, set aside the kick, the protoneutron star we expect to be somewhat spherically symmetric. Infall is quite spherically symmetric, so those things are fine. But other things like titanium-44 synthesis that requires matter to kind of hang around in this region, doing complicated trajectories, being heated, cooled before it gets ejected, those things we cannot capture with push.
Okay. So actually, it's
think
very
this-
interesting to know that the pulsar kicks can still, once you subtract them, that the protostar may be effectively symmetric and captures many features. So I think that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Are there more questions for Carla? Okay, I do not see any. So thank you again for giving this wonderful talk, and we will meet next week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.